Hello, this is Dane with Saving Stormwater, and I'm here today with Rhett Kirby down in Texas. He does a lot of environmental work down there. Rhett, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, and you, Dane?
It's gorgeous up here. Spring's finally coming, so it's wonderful.
That's right.
So
That's
Rhett,
great.
tell me a little bit about what you do, specifically stormwater related in that industry, but just in general with environmental work down in Texas.
Okay. Really, everything we do stems back to stormwater compliance.
Hmm.
It may not on the surface stem from stormwater compliance, but if you look into why we do what we do in civil construction, which is primarily in the energy sector, for us, that's where we focus. That's where a lot of our work, primarily that's where we work. Most of everything we do is related to temporary and permanent stabilization requirements of stormwater compliance.
Hmm.
So that's kind of from a 50,000 foot level. That's what we do.
Gotcha. And how did you get into this industry? Like, what's your story there?
Well, that's kind of a unique story. So, in 2000, our Curtech LLC, we formed 5 years ago, roughly 5 years ago in 2014, as we saw a need for reclamation services in the civil construction world. And I say our, primarily it's me and my brother. Our background is really in plant and soil science, primarily from an agronomic standpoint. But it became obvious that there was a need for reclamation services, for science-based reclamation services in civil construction. Civil construction is very much concrete and steel.
Hmm.
It's very binary, whereas what we do is not binary. What we do is very much trying to monitor and mitigate the risk of multiple variables, whether it's rainfall, whether it's wind, whether it's heat. So what we do is not binary. What we do is not typical to civil construction. So it became very obvious that civil construction, it was very hard for a binary industry to grasp the needs of environmental reclamation.
Hmm.
So we found ourselves able to leverage that and move into that space.
Gotcha. And I have heard a lot about this. I mean, obviously in civil engineering, there's been kind of it's stuck primarily with what you said with concrete and steel, but more and more people are pushing for geoscaping, like a lot more grass and vegetation to mitigate some of the stormwater runoff. What are some of the effects you've seen with that? Like, how has it benefited some of the areas you've worked in and some of the projects you've been associated with?
Well, a lot of the areas I work are semi-arid and arid climate. So that's unique to most stormwater projects. Most
Yeah.
stormwater projects are thought of as 40-inch rainfall areas where they're dealing with water and they're dealing with lots of moisture, lots of rain. Well, the projects that I work on, that's not always the case. What the projects that I work on, in particular, like wind farms, solar farms, they're in areas where it doesn't rain much, and that creates somewhat of a fragile ecosystem.
Hmm.
So when you disturb large areas of a fragile ecosystem, you have to be prepared to temporarily and permanently stabilize that area, because otherwise it would take generations to reestablish. So you have to, in my opinion, be willing to utilize vegetation as your tool.
Hmm.
You can't, it's not feasible to lay 2,000 acres of erosion control blanket. That's really not in anyone's budget.
Yeah.
So you've got to learn, and in my opinion, civil engineering, civil construction, there is a huge need for understanding that exactly that vegetation needs to be a component of the reclamation plan, and it not be thought of as binary. It needs to be thought of as very much a collaborative effort that is a moving target involving multiple variables that change day to day. And so somebody with experience needs to be able to help guide and maneuver through the project as those variables change. Whether it's wind, whether it's seasons of the fall, winter, summer, or whether it's a big rainstorm, nothing's binary. Everything's changing. So that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, where today is different than yesterday, and so being resourceful and thinking on your toes and having experience in those situations is very important.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think it's interesting. The climate you're working at is very similar to the one I'm in, right? Down there in Texas, it's very arid, and up here in Utah, we have a lot of that as well. And a lot of pushback we've gotten in maintaining good erosion control and stormwater control is that people say, well, it's an arid climate, kind of like what you said. There's not that much rain. How would you respond to that? Like, is it just as important to have good stormwater procedures and erosion control in arid climates as it is, say, somewhere wetter like Missouri?
Absolutely. To me, it's a little bit esoteric to understand the needs of erosion control in arid and semi-arid climates. What you just said is exactly what I hear every day, is that nothing grows here anyway. And that is, to the layman, that may be the case, because they may be a construction contractor from another state that has been here 6 months, and in their 6 months they say, or they see, wow, this is a very desolate area. What they don't have the context to know that historically that ecosystem sustained a great short grass prairie. They don't, the layperson doesn't understand that, and that's okay. But we as professionals in the industry need to be able to verbalize and have a position in that and say, yes, there may not be growing anything today or even the last 2 years, but that's not to say that something shouldn't be growing here, because it should. Mother Nature has this area stabilized. Otherwise, it would be a wreck. So Mother Nature stabilizes this area, and I think we need to understand how Mother Nature does it, and then replicate that in a way that allows for us to accomplish stabilization on a much shorter timeline.
Yeah, interesting. And again, some of the things you're saying are similar problems we've run into up here. Do you have any thoughts on the best way to train those contractors who are a little skeptical about stormwater controls in an arid environment? How do you deal with that normally?
I have tried multiple different tactics. In an arid climate, there's generally two reasons why a contractor, from my experience, takes action to implement erosion control BMPs. It's because they're told to by the regulatory agency, or their project actually is at risk in some way, and so there is very little voluntary, or if it is voluntary, it's pretty minimal. It's to create maybe the facade that we are accomplishing stormwater compliance, and they may have a rock entrance, but they may have a rock entrance to 100 acres of bare soil that's blowing and washing away. And so it's there needs to be some perspective and some so I don't know the answer to your question. I think awareness, public awareness. I think it's a transition. I think as the professionals in the industry, as your podcast, for example, I mean, as we create awareness in saying that, that stormwater compliance is not simply a rock entrance with some silt fence around the front of the project when the
Yeah.
whole project is blowing or washing away. There needs to be some perspective, and I think that awareness and education will slowly change that, but I think it's a very slow process. Um, and so I really don't know what the silver bullet is
Yeah.
to answer your question. It's a struggle. It really is a struggle.
No, it is. I totally agree. I mean, with people I've talked to, I think in any state it's a similar concern, and a lot of people have said things on the similar line. There needs to be more awareness and education about these issues. One big
Well,
concern. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I would say not only educating the contractors, but educating the regulatory officials that oversee or approve, like a stormwater, like a SWIP.
Yeah.
Our local MS4. I've spent too much time probably visiting with them about how they approve a SWIP for implementation in our area. And there is so much room for improvement. Personally, it's mind-boggling to see what I see in that. It's the same thing. It's they put a rock entrance and some silt fence up,
Yeah.
and even the regulatory officials see that as they're making an effort. Well, and that's true, they did make an effort. That's great. I applaud them for that effort. But what I would like to see is science-based options and science-based understanding be utilized in the approval process of those SWIPs, because there were voids left in the. I mean, there's a couple that come to mind where they're building like 100 acres worth of home sites, and it is just, there is no temporary stabilization, but they've got a silt fence around the front, and
Yeah.
and I've made the suggestion, why don't you seed that area as an effort to accomplish temporary stabilization? Because they're running. The funny thing is they're running water trucks as dust suppression to keep the dust down on those 100 acres. And so my suggestion was, why don't you put some seed out ahead of those water trucks so that you actually can generate some vegetation and reduce your water input, which ultimately preserves our aquifer. I mean, it's more environmentally conscious. There's lots of reasons to do that, and it ultimately will save them money in the long run. But the officials at the MS4 basically said, we never thought of that, and it's like they're not practitioners of the science, and I wish the practitioners of the science had a larger platform, and I think your podcast, some of the things we're doing on LinkedIn and Facebook, I think elevating ourselves in social media platforms where we have as practitioners of the science, be able to say, now here's how it should be done or could be done, and so I think awareness such as that may be a way to see that the whole industry is elevated, that we all elevate together through awareness and education.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a couple points you brought up that I'd like to touch a little more on. You mentioned some ways that we can make, some better ways that we can control erosion. Obviously, putting seeds down as well as the water. What are some other effective ways you found that you think are easy for contractors and MS4s to do?
I don't. Let me add somebody else to that list. for instance, I guess a form of contractor would be a one that comes to mind that I'm dealing with currently is a solar farm that where they had to cut and fill to level the area to a satisfactory to allow for the panels to face the sun correctly, and their cut and fill was so extensive that there was perennial vegetation in place that could have been preserved. And I'm not worried. Don't hear me as saying preserve as in preserve the plants. I'm saying preserve the perennial species in a way to prevent future problems. We have the ability to reseed those areas, but a little bit of thought, and there again, this kind of goes back to I really think one of the solutions that maybe not for the contractor, but for the owners of large projects would be to separate the reclamation from the construction, because construction is construction. Construction is not reclamation, and it would be like asking a reclamation company to construct a building. I don't know. It seems odd that we ask construction companies to reclaim soil. They know nothing about that. I mean, it's nothing against them. It's just those are two areas, two disciplines that need to be treated as two disciplines. Lumping them together under a contractor that is responsible for concrete and steel and is also responsible for a discipline they know nothing about. It's kind of a recipe for disaster. It doesn't really make sense to me when there's professionals in the industry that are willing to take on the risk of accomplishing reclamation on the construction project. That's, to me, that's one thing. Back to your question a couple ago, that would be one thing that could take place, is that professional science-based reclamation companies be utilized separately from the concrete and steel discipline and treated as its own discipline from a planning standpoint and from an implementation standpoint. So you don't have these two disciplines where there's no benefit for those disciplines to overlap. So as far as that would be probably the best thing that I think could happen to promote stormwater compliance.
Yeah, I think so too. I think what you said is spot on, where sometimes we're expecting a lot of disciplines to overlap. Like you mentioned with contractors, they don't know anything about it, so why are they expected to do some of these things when they've got a million other things they're also worrying about in addition?
Absolutely.
And so recently you posted a project you're working on LinkedIn, and I was just curious if you could go in a little bit more detail on what you're doing there, just so we can get a feel of what you deal with day to day and what kind of things you're working on.
I'm sorry, I've posted quite a few different projects, and we've been really blessed this spring, and we've got quite a few things going. So which one are you referring to?
Let me see. I think it was just 2 days ago. You were in front of kind of like a greenish lawn. Let me see if I can pull it up here on LinkedIn. Just a moment. You did mention that you should do a podcast about that certain project, so I was.
Just a little more context. I'm sorry. I've done quite a few lately, and they those LinkedIn posts run together somewhat. I think it was it about self-performing your own reclamation?
I think yes. I think that's what it was. Is the self-performing?
I do remember I don't remember the project.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. We've got about 10 different projects that we're working on right now. But to kind of give you,
maybe just give me like maybe just give me kind of an idea of what you're doing on some of these projects, just pick maybe one or
Yeah.
two and
So, well, one of them that had quite a bit of traction on LinkedIn was a FERC, Federal Energy Reserve Commission project that we did, which was a high pressure natural gas line that those are FERC regulated pipelines.
yeah.
So they essentially have stormwater compliance requirements. Essentially, I mean, there's some differences there, but essentially they function, or the requirements are the same. So the contractor, here's a perfect example of why I feel like these disciplines do not need to be overlapping. The contractor on this site did not separate or segregate the topsoil from the subsoil. So when I was asked to come out to the site was nothing but rocks, because that was the subsoil. When they trenched in the pipe, they obviously the trenching machine brought up a lot of rocks. Well, those rocks ended up on top of the ground, and they, over the last few years, I think 2 years, had spent $250,000 in watering the rocks. Basically, they thought that the contractor thought that simply applying water would establish some sort of vegetation. And here's where soil science comes in. Soil science and reclamation and stormwater compliance, in my opinion, all go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
They simply thought that watering these unfertile rocks would generate some sort of vegetation to accomplish their 70% revegetation requirement. So they spent a lot of money and had no success, and then asked for me to come and offer my opinion.
Yeah.
So I put a proposal together where we hauled in topsoil blended with compost, and we applied that, and then we applied biotic earth on top of that with the seed, with a native grass and forb species blended together with the biotic earth, and then we ultimately put on top a hydraulically applied mulch for erosion control. So we did about 5 different steps to allow for that site to become fertile enough to sustain vegetation, because simply watering the rocks was not going to accomplish vegetation.
Yeah.
So we had to put some soil out there, and I hate to sound derogatory towards another industry, but it's sad that other industry, that other discipline is being required to invest money that they're not really educated or trained to implement. And so it's really a waste from an owner's standpoint to hire a contractor that's not in the wrong discipline. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to hire me to weld the pipeline together.
Yeah.
So I hope that through awareness and stories like this, where it begins to, a light bulb comes on and says, yeah, it doesn't make sense to do it that way. Why are we doing it that way? That's one example. Another example is a wind farm where we were asked to provide some temporary stabilization, and we did that through blowing native Indian grass hay and crimping it into the soil behind our seeding equipment. So it was seeded, and then we blew hay, and then we crimped that hay in, and that crimping process, it stands the mulch or the hay up. It kind of pushes it in the soil, and it allows it to stand upright, which that in a semi-arid environment, your goal is to accomplish standing residue, not necessarily residue laying on the ground, but vertical standing residue, because it provides the most wind protection, and it provides shading for new germination to take place. So that's been a success. We've done quite a few hydromulch jobs, a lot of drill seeding. We do provide a lot of drill seeding in a lot of oil and gas scenarios. We probably somewhere, our best estimations are in 2018, we seeded in all different forms 6,000 to 8,000 acres, whether that was drill seeding or hydro seeding. So we knocked out a pretty good amount of acres last year. So, and this year we're hoping to do something similar.
Yeah, and it sounds like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like this goes back a little bit of what we were talking about earlier. It sounds like for a lot of these contractors, a lot of these companies, compliance isn't actually, it's more expensive to just have a facade of compliance than to actually be compliant. Has that been your experience, or?
So is your question, is it more expensive to be compliant?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, we've talked earlier about how a lot of companies will do things like they'll put out the silt fence or other things, not necessarily because they care about actually making sure that they are preventing erosion and some of these other things, but because they want to check the boxes. And it sounds like a lot of the work you're doing is actually helping these companies save money and be compliant. Has that been your experience, or?
Yeah, and I really truly believe that there is a mutually beneficial opportunity that when done correctly, reclamation can accomplish cost savings and compliance, and that's there again. I used the word esoteric earlier. To me, it is an esoteric process to understand how that takes place. To somebody that's not involved day to day, that hasn't done this for 15 or 20 years every day of their life, yeah, it doesn't make sense to say we need to spend extra money to be compliant. Well, in my professional experience, you can do both. You can save money and be compliant if you utilize resources and ideas that may not have been, they may not be mainstream, like put seed out in front of your water truck. I mean, just some little things that to a person that's done it every day, it seems obvious that there's ways to make improvements, but until the professionals in the industry have opportunities to make an impact, it's going to be real hard for someone on the outside, exoterically, to understand how to do that. So I think we have an uphill battle, but I'm doing it every day.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're doing a wonderful job down there. I mean, a lot of these things we've talked about with seeding is something that I don't think is caught on quite as much up here, but I really hope it does, because it sounds amazing. And I run into people a lot where, you mentioned stormwater or some of these regulation things, and it's just like, oh man, this is another box we have to check. This is another thing we have to do before we can build the project. And like you said, the goal is, no, this is going to save you money if you can just give us 15 minutes to explain this. Like, we're saving you money long term, and when this project is built, there has to be a plan in place to make sure that the controls are still there. Do you do a lot of long-term plans for sites that are built, or try and reclaim any of those, or mostly just the construction sites?
So I'll say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That definitely applies to what we are referring to. And so yes, what we do, what I do every day is work, and especially more and more in the solar industry than any other industry, is really work with the owners of the project to implement science-based preventative practices very early in the planning stages, to implement some ideas and practices that will save them millions of dollars in the end. And because I'm on a project right now, I can't say much about it, but I'm on a project where that is exactly the case, where there was no planning on the front end, and now the erosion is so bad the full project is at risk. It is at risk for damaging the equipment, and so the amount of investment now required to stabilize the area is I don't know, 10, 20, 30 fold what the investment would have been on the front end to have just done some preventative things, to have prevented all the problems that we're seeing today. But there again, it comes back to having context and perspective. I know you and I have context and perspective to say you need to prevent this. But to a contractor or to a company that owns a project, without context and perspective, they don't really know what's at risk. And that's the hardest thing to explain to somebody on the front of a project, to explain to them what this project will look like in 6 months or a year from now if you don't implement these practices. That's so hard for them to understand because they've never been down that path, or they've been down that path in a different region of the country. They've been down that path in a different scenario. And it's not binary. So you've got to understand the environmental variables that you're working with. So I hope that professionals in the industry continue to elevate themselves in a way that our perspective and opinions are able to offer some context for those project owners and implement preventative practices that save them millions of dollars. And so I don't know what the silver bullet is, but I do think that awareness and trying to elevate the industry is very important. And I think your podcast is doing a great job of that.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And Rhett, it's been a pleasure to have you on. We are coming up at the end, it looks like. Do you have any final words or anything you just like to say to sum up the podcast?
No, I appreciate you guys reaching out to me and giving me the opportunity to speak on your podcast. And as far as our company is concerned, we're a nationwide mobile company. We work all throughout the United States. We primarily focus on arid and semi-arid climates because that's what we're good at. But if the opportunity arises where we have the ability to work in an area that has high rainfall, we're perfectly suited to do that as well. So I appreciate the opportunity, Dane, to speak and to be in front of those that listen to your podcast. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rhett. It's been a pleasure. Again, for the audience, this is Saving Stormwater. Thanks for listening.
Hey everyone! Thanks for listening to the Saving Stormwater Podcast. This podcast is dedicated to the Value of Water campaign on October 21st of every year. This episode is one of a few special episodes we have saved in our archives, and we want to thank Rhett Kirby for joining us on this episode, and want to thank you as well for listening to our podcast. If you want to support this podcast, please check out our stormwater inspection software, Compliance Go. It's a great way for you to start seeing immediate improvements to your inspection program, as well as unify everyone on stormwater compliance. Everyone can be on the same page simply by opening an email. You don't have to even pay to test it out. We give you the ability to start inspecting on one project for the entire life of that project, just so that you know that Compliance Go will improve your process over time. Please check it out at the link in the podcast description, and always remember to give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and be a part of the effort to save stormwater. Thanks!